And because it takes so many forms, number 5, this translating or translatoriality is not always recognized as such by any of the participants. Those doing it, those being involved in it, also not necessarily by all researchers. And this takes us to the idea of translation concept that we have in our head and in our discipline, and whether it covers what it covers and what it does not cover. And these kinds of questions have been bugging me for the past maybe 10 years or so. So what even is translation, and is translation a good term to describe what I have in mind? This all started, I can quite sort of distinctly state a starting point for my reconsiderations from a conference that we had in Tampere 2009, and Michael Cronin was giving a keynote speech and talking about Sherry Simon's book Translating Montreal, and it really hit me like lightning. Oh my gosh, this is what we need to be doing. Michael was saying that you need this because he was talking about microspection and the methodological issues and stuff, and he was saying that we need to start researching where we are. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes, indeed, we need to do that. And I'm in Tampere. I need to start researching Tampere. So you'll see a quotation from Sherry Simon's book about translation becoming an analytical tool, a lens that allowed her to look into Montreal as a translation space. And what I did together with many colleagues, because this is an edited volume, what you see in the middle, it is in Finnish, but it says Translating Tampere, or more or less says in translation, Translated Tampere. What we did was not to try repeat what Sherry Simon had done, but take many viewpoints into the city of Tampere and the kinds of translation that are going on in the professional side, in the non-professional side of the everyday life of Tampere people. So this is where I started kind of my journey towards rethinking what the object of study of my research, of the research of translation studies is, and for this, what are the conceptualizations that we can use to describe these phenomena that we are trying to capture. In the book, my own contribution was on the linguistic landscape of not the entire city of Tampere, but one area within Tampere. So I was really looking into a micro phenomena, very small instances of translation. This is this photo is an example not of my research, but my colleague's research, who was looking in that same book, who was Sea Jingelin Orenma, who was looking into the Swedish-speaking minority in Tampere and their realms, their Swedish-speaking realms. And this is actually this is a street sign that you can still find in Tampere. Tampere has signage only in Finnish. There's a legal system in Finland regulating what kind of signage you need to have in which city, and how you need to be bilingual or not, depending on the Swedish-speaking minority, and which one is up and which one is down is also varying. But this one is a reminder of the time when Tampere had bilingual signage, because now we don't otherwise have, and it is on the wall of the Swedish-speaking school of Tampere. So a kind of a way of remembering via keeping the translatoriality that once existed as a sort of a memorial site in a way, and recognition of a previous existence and a continuing existence of a minority that is not very visible in the linguistic landscape otherwise. But interestingly, it is also an act of resistance, in the sense that what you do not see here is the Russian-speaking signage that we also had across Finland for 15 years or so at the turn of the 20th century. when Finland was under the Russian rule and until our independence. So what we want to remember and what we don't want to remember can also be translatorial in nature. And it can be translatorial, obviously, in many ways, but also in interlingual ways. So capturing this kind of minute moments of translation was the first thing that I did. These are samples from my data for the linguistic landscapes research for the book and publications that I've published elsewhere. And what I kind of ran into, starting like a sort of very, I don't know, innocently, I started collecting this data, and then I realized that I need to do a lot of assuming here. That obviously I can't really guarantee that, for example, our shop, Meidän Kauppa magazine, is a translation of any sort, and if so, which one is the translation and which one is the source? And so I needed to somehow wanted to capture translatedness, another awkward term that I was using at the time. What was the only thing really that was interesting for me personally in the linguistic landscape was how they use translation to communicate in more than one language. And by walking the streets and taking photos, obviously I had no access to the actual process of producing these multilingual signage. So I needed to use assumed translation as a methodological tool to capture translatedness, as I was calling it then. Now I would probably say translatoriality, but as you already know, I'm not good at coming up with excellent terminology straight away. So I've been struggling, and you can find different phases in my research. But what it also has taken me to is, as I was mentioning earlier, to the work of Sandra Halvarsson that is not recent. So there's publications from 1998 to 2000, and I was aware of that at the time. I remember Sandra Halvarsson publishing these articles and me reading these articles, and not really, I was like, yeah, okay, but it didn't, I was not, in my own research, in my own path, I was not there yet. I was not thinking about these questions, so I didn't really fully understand how relevant this might be for me later. I'm so glad I found it now, but really what Sandra Halvarsson was doing back at the turn of the millennium, she was approaching what at the point was kind of the dominant understanding maybe of how we define translation, which was from Gideon Turi's work, that translations are target culture phenomena, and what is recognized as a translation is a translation in that particular culture. And Sandra Halvarsson was kind of allowing us to see that there's a scale, or there's increased fuzziness in what we can understand as translation, and that there are phenomena in a culture that everybody kind of sees as a translation, and then others where we are more divided. So some people say that, yeah, this is still a translation, and others are saying, maybe not. So this helped me tremendously in understanding why I'm sometimes a little bit maybe struggling with what I want to study and how it fits in the disciplinary frameworks that I'm trying to apply. So what Sandra Halvarsson did was to administer questionnaires to Norwegian language students and give them a scale of 1 to 7 on how confident they are that a particular example is a translation. So for example, how confident they are saying that in saying that a red traffic light is a translation of a stop sign. Is it or is it not? Or a painting, a translation of a musical piece. And then we get the variations, and we can see that in the middle, everybody is kind of in agreement, and then it becomes more blurry. And what it also allows us to see that we need to also study translation concept. And this is a concept the translation concept is a concept that comes from translation process studies. And if you have ideas of good studies that look into this in particular, I'd be very eager to know, because I've been trying to find, but I haven't yet found in that research area anyone really focusing on the translation concept per se, and how that develops, and how varied these are for us. But I think there's room for a lot of research also into how this happens, how cognitively, how we develop a particular translation concept, and how and to what extent are we able to shift that? Is it a very sort of, does it stay or does it change easily, and if so, how? And stuff like that. And I've been also promoting for quite some time, for what I would hope somebody would do, is to follow the logic of folk linguistics. That is an existing tradition in linguistics, to look into lay people's understandings of language and their language ideologies, and do the same for translation. So folk translatoriality, that would be a wonderful topic for somebody to take on, so that we would also know more about how people outside translation studies and outside the profession actually do understand translating and interpreting. We do a lot of assuming into what is the stereotyped understanding, and we expect, perhaps easily, we expect the folk understandings to be reduced or narrow or somehow stereotypical, but we don't really know. And it would be interesting to do similar to questionnaire studies, for example, and see how they respond. But to look more in detail into Sandra Halversson's model, and how I see it, is that at the center, where everybody says, yeah, this is a translation, we would have full text translations from language A to language B. So clearly defined languages that are separated in our minds, and a full text that is being processed. And movement either from written to written, so in our parlance translation, or oral to oral, interpreting, that would be easier to recognize and very much in the center. Also in the center, we will have the strict notions of equivalence. So no shifting, no sliding, no muddy waters in terms of adapting content in any case, in any way. That would take us to the center of the prototype. I'm here mentioning also frozen translations. So for example, if I was opening a meeting at my own university, I would probably nowadays say, "Hyvää huomenta, good morning," and it would not go through my brain as a translation. It would be something that I repeat in two languages, sort of automatically. So similar to frozen metaphors, I think we also have frozen translations. Whether or not these go at the center, I'm not entirely sure, because they are so formulaic, idiomatic, that maybe for some this would not be at the center. But what we also have seen in recent years is definitely a rise, a sort of remembering of Roman Jakobson's typology of interlingual, intralingual, and intersemiotic translation. This comes up again and again nowadays, because many people are struggling with the same things that I am talking about, and in also sort of we will continue this discussion tomorrow, and I know there's also a workshop on this topic. So this is very much a question for all of translation studies. So how do we operate, and where do we draw the lines? And for Roman Jakobson, interlingual translation, he called it translation proper. So that would be translation that is at the center of the prototype model of translation. So this is, I apologize, I know I'm terribly bad with these visuals. So this is a very, it's not a beautiful picture, but I hope you recognize what I'm trying to say. So in the middle, there's equivalence, there's interlingual translation, there's full text translations, there's translations that are labeled as such. There are the texts that are that the translator's name is given. So very overt translation would go into the middle probably. And next, the next circle, then I can see that my line is not even taking us long enough, but it would be anything that has shifts or swaying or target orientation, scopus, driving shifts and adaptations in the text, domestication, so on and so forth, and also covert translation. So not as easily recognized because it is not signposted as one. And then you move a little bit away from the center with intralingual, intermodal, fragmentary, summarizing, code switching, translanguaging. You can also see that conceptualization starts shifting because people are hesitant about whether or not this is still translation or there's a translation element in them, and then they start using different terms. Actually, translanguaging and related terms in social linguistics is a fascinating field because they are clearly trying, in multilingual studies, they are trying to capture what goes on when different languages meet and mingle, and they have a lot of conceptualizations that are competing. I think translanguaging is probably one of the best known nowadays, but there's many others as well. And then the last one, translation as a metaphor. And I wanted to mention this in particular because this is a topic that I've been working on together with two colleagues from International Business and Organization Studies. And I've had this collaboration for almost 10 years now, and it's been really, really useful and fruitful for my own thinking in translation and on translation studies. There's been a lot of discussion about interdisciplinary collaborations in translation studies recently, and I think it is a wonderful opportunity, particularly in the sense that it forces you to rethink the most obvious, taken for granted, never thought out elements of your own discipline and your own thinking. So together with them, Rebecca Piekkari and Susanne Tietze, I spent weekends together trying to think about what is the essence of interlingual translation actually, or how it differs from other kinds of translation, other kinds of translations that are called translation in their disciplines. And this is a table that is actually, it is from a paper that we published. I modified it, so it's not exactly the same, but it is that the content is more or less what we've published. And we in that paper, we argue that in organizations, in multilingual organizations, and most organizations are multilingual nowadays, what you find is both interlingual translation and what we call metaphorical translation. And interlingual translation would be the translation studies understanding of translation between languages, and it would be language and text-based, and it would involve natural languages, so no intersemiotic here, as you can see. It would be about finding relevant sameness between source and target texts, fit necessary adaptations to fit the translation in the new context. It took us quite some time to come up with that formulation, for example. And it's primarily professional translators, but sometimes also paraprofessional translators. I will come back to this later. And they undertake interlingual translation as part of their work. And the dominant view of what translation is about is that it is a decision-making process that brings closure and direction through language choices. Again, a formulation that we struggled to come by with. And metaphorical translation, but the kind of translation that you find if you are reading into organization studies. So most commonly, they talk a lot about translation, and most commonly it would be this metaphorical kind of translating a process through which practices get modified when they are moved to a new organizational context. So for example, lean management, sort of bringing in a neoliberal system into the East European organizations when the social system changed. So very different from having texts actually being processed, because it is also materializations of practices, but texts will be included in the process. And it is fitting the new practice in the receiving context and making it locally relevant. And this would be paraprofessional translators who undertake both metaphorical and interlingual translation. And translation as an open-ended, ongoing sense-making and sense-giving process. And why I'm talking about this is to let you know that for me, I'll go back a little bit. For me, this kind of translation is where I currently stop. I can't, sort of, for me, this is no longer within my fuzzy concept of translation. I don't know why, really. I've been thinking about it, why I can't really. I need to call it metaphorical because it kind of signals that this is no longer actual translation, but similar to it. And maybe in a couple of years I will change my mind, but this is where I am at the moment. I have sort of found my borders in terms of what I can and I'm willing to include in my concept of translation or translatoriality. So this is where we somehow move into a different realm. So the question to me and now also to all of you maybe is, where do we draw the line, or do we draw a line? Does it matter if we draw a line? And some examples to give you ideas of what you might want to be thinking about. For example, as many of you probably know, social media is now full of dogs and cats having their own accounts and memes on how they speak, and we also already had our own dog in this session. So if we have, as we have, a lot of content where humans are giving us in human language, in dog style human language, what the dog is thinking. Is this translation? Is this interpreting the dog? Is this interpretation or not? And I do not have an answer, and I don't want to give one, but I want you to think about it. Is this translatorial action? Is this translation? Then another one, the memes. You've seen the laughing man, I'm sure, and you've seen Hitler hears this and that. And yeah, thank you, Peter, in the chat. A good comment. We also have pseudo translation, so we may have a fictional translation process going on here. The memes for the dog, by the way. And then for the memes, we have another kind of situation where we have a subtitling tool, which is a translation tool, being used to produce something that appears like a subtitling and is actually subtitled. It's subtitled videos, but with a particular aim of being entirely non-equivalent and also being funny. So I discussed this at length in the effect book because I wanted to explore the carnivalesque, the fun side of translating and the kinds of effects that are involved. And I was, again, I kind of hesitated in the book about whether this is actually translating or not. And I'm very grateful to one of the anonymous referees who pushed me a little bit on this, saying that because if you agree that all kinds of things are still translation, why stop here? Why start thinking that you might need some sort of semantic element to be there if you've already given up on equivalence on so many other fronts? So I'm currently, this is kind of, I'm now gradually, I guess I'm accepting this within my translation concept, within the area. There's definitely, it's translatorial. It's using the kinds of elements that are very translatorial, but it's kind of a borderline case. And many people would say no. I've tested this actually in a lecture recently, and the audience said no. quite sort of, they were in agreement about not accepting this, but it is kind of depends on where you draw the line. And now, as many of you may know, we've had very interesting discussions. Scopus Marais in particular is having is moving us forward in thinking what translation studies is and should be in the future, and what we might want to include as our object of study. And he has been, for example, talking about interspecies translation, the ways that different plants, here I have trees, different animals communicate with one another and whether there's translation there, so that no human pseudo translation or real translation is taking place, but simply sort of the species are having a communication moment. So is this also translatorial? And if so, is it the task of translation studies to study it? And I find this a fascinating discussion, and I don't have answers. Well, I have some answers towards the end of this presentation, but no final answers, let me say, about what we should or should not do. But it's wonderful to see that translation studies is again sort of in a process of rethinking itself, in reprocessing its role in the academia and in the world, and seeing what we might be needed for. One more example, I mentioned this yesterday in the Q&A part, a question about technology, because it is unavoidable for us at the moment. In translation studies, in professional practice, the technological developments and their future is something that we really need to take into account. So in the EST Congress, there was this panel co-organized by Dorothy Kenny, Mary Nurminen, and Felix do Carmo, asking participants, is machine translation? And it went on for quite some time. Maybe many of you may have participated. I found it extremely valuable to be able to listen to at least some of the presentations and the differing answers, because it was for some yes and for others no, and it opens up new questions about how we want to define translating and translatorial action and translatoriality. And it seems to me personally that saying that machine translation is not translation is very difficult to do. It creates an impasse in the sense that what is becoming the most common and widely used form of translation, we would then say that it is actually not. And then on the other hand, we know that the process that goes on, there's no resemblance to the process of translatorial rethinking of content and styling it to the new environment and so on and so forth. So the machine translates completely different from the human, so actually doesn't translate but produces translations. So it's very also difficult to say yes, it is, but it's equally difficult to say no, it isn't. So I'm hoping they're going to publish. I hope there's going to be a publication on this, and we can see the different sort of arguments for and against, and move our own thinking further. Because for many people, I'd argue at the moment, this is at the very center of their prototypical concept of translation. This is also, for many years ago already, when you put translator in the Google's sort of picture search slot, you would mainly get computers only. So it is kind of it's becoming the dominant form of translation, similar to computers actually. In the olden days, computers used to be humans also, and now it is only machines. So no cottage industry of computing difficult calculations any longer. So it's interesting to see where we are going, but the terrain is definitely moving, and we need to take stock of that and rethink and reconsider, and then perhaps move on. But at the moment, we are clearly, as a discipline, we are clearly in a moment of not knowing exactly what would be the best solutions or most logical ways forward, and we will probably not find the same answers, all of us, but we will have our own answers and take on different roads from there. So perhaps a couple of words in favor of translatoriality. So why I feel it might be useful at this point, and at least for my own research. It's definitely necessary to also recognize fragmentary and fleeting moments of translating, because this is a dominant form in multilingual contexts with no professionals around. This is what you get most of the time in many cases. What I also like is that it avoids translation versus interpreting dichotomy. This is a difficult one for translation studies. As you can see, I keep on saying translation studies, but I know that the trend has recently been towards saying translation and interpreting studies. This is it's kind of in a flux, has been for a while, but this has been the move has more been towards saying translation and interpreting studies than just translation studies. But I've resisted. Well, sometimes I do that, but I kind of resisted because I've been thinking that this is now a reflection on a situation that we had in the maybe early 2000s, where these two modes were kind of centrally relevant to separate, and it was very valuable for interpreting studies to get the recognition because it had been growing and there was really still is a boom in interpreting studies. But now I feel that with the new terrain and the new, again, shifting situation, it might take us backwards rather than forward to now introduce this new disciplinary name that somehow emphasizes the dichotomy of oral versus written, when actually also this is shifting quite freely in many of the situations that we might be willing to look into. And then another one is that it has some pre-existing theoretical backing that I have found useful, and that will be Justa Holz-Mänttäri's theory of translatorial action. The thing is that there are two competing translations for her translatorisches Handeln. One is translatorial action and the other one is translational action. And also, again, in my own writing, even I've sort of hesitated between translatoriality and translationality. And I'm still not entirely sure if I've made the right choice, but it seems to me that translational is somehow, it's used a lot. It is commonly in use, but it is a little bit perhaps undefined. So people use it without actually sort of explaining what it is. And I'm trying to do something different with translatoriality. I'm trying to define it the best I can and somehow sort of also link it to a theoretical framework. And so translatorial to me seems a better translation for what Holz-Mänttäri was trying to do, and translatoriality a better term for me because I try to create a link to Holz-Mänttäri's prior work. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it opens up new vistas and brings to light practices and phenomena currently largely, not entirely, but largely uncovered by research. So saying translatoriality instead of translation is kind of has a potential of sort of broadening our scope in translation studies and definitely for my own research. So a few words about Holz-Mänttäri. The name probably is familiar to maybe all of you, most of you, but it has not been too easy and still is not too easy to actually read into Holz-Mänttäri's theory. And also, well, you may or may not know that Justa Holz-Mänttäri is a German by origin, but has worked in Finland. Her academic career has been at the University of Tampere and University of Turku. So already back in the 1980s, when I was a student of translation, I already knew of this theory. And with hindsight, I can also see that that our training was very much sort of in this. It was functionalist in the sense of Holz-Mänttäri's thinking, although my major was in English, and we kind of saw our perhaps content being slightly different from the German section that was really into Holz-Mänttäri, but still it was there always. But it took me to the year 2014 to actually struggle with my very poor German skills through Holz-Mänttäri's thesis. It's her PhD thesis that is the sort of core of of the theory, and there's no translations around either for Finnish or English or any language. And a German academic language is not the easiest, and this is not an easy task. So it took me a while, but what it is it is a sociological model that fit my purposes well, because this is the area where I've been. It is also an ideological model, and this is where I struggled, because for Holz-Mänttäri, the theory is very much about professional translation, professionalization of translation, and translators as professional experts. And what I wanted to use it for was non-professional translation practices in the 19th century Tampere municipal government. So there was a little bit of a sort of a tension there as to whether I can ignore some very core element of somebody's work and simply take on other aspects and move away, sort of steal them away from what she wanted to accomplish and use it for something completely different. But the usability of this theory is also on new conceptualizations very much, and these were very useful for me. So translator this is actually a Finnish word, translatori. It is kind of foreignizing a little bit, similar to what I've been trying to do, the kind of expectations that we might already have, and particularly not talking about translations, but message carriers. So moving away from the kind of self-evident idea of translation and saying that after the process of analyzing the situation and taking the scopus into account and thinking what is the best course of action, anything can be a message carrier. It doesn't even need to be a text. And this is a freeing idea. Also, translatorial action does not need to result in a translation. So you can go through the process and not produce a translation as such. So these were elements that I was very fond of. So when I needed a framework to sort out my data on paraprofessional, here's the word again, I'll sort of move on to it shortly. Translation practices in the 19th century Tampere, I wasn't sure if I can simply ignore the ideological aspects, and then I decided that this has to be okay. The theories need to move forward, and Holz-Mänttäri's theory in particular was a little bit frozen because it is mainly from a PhD study, and anyone who's been around for longer knows that we move on, we develop our thinking. The PhD is not the end point of your thinking and your findings and your understanding of your topic. You move on, but because of her personal life and situation, she was unable to do that, and so it became reified in ways that it's not necessarily very healthy for any theoretical framework. Nobody kind of dare touch it, and so there were consequences. Really, not everybody was happy with what I was doing, and I needed to withdraw a paper and everything. But in any case, definitely it was useful for my purposes in trying to understand a situation where there definitely were no professional translators around in Finland and in Tampere at the time. This was not an option. There were no professional translators and interpreters to pick up, and so it needed to be done otherwise. And there's a publication, Koskinen 2017, where I sort of lay out the framework in more detail. In my own research, I've been looking into, as you now know, into the linguistic landscapes and the translatorial practices, 19th century Tampere, in several publications. Most recently, looking into translatoriality and mediation in foreign language learning. And if you look into the European framework of languages, you will find that the contemporary teachers of foreign languages, they are expected to teach a lot of mediation skills to the students. And I really mean a lot. And there's a lot of translating and interpreting that is in the sort of framework and expected to be covered and assessed. And my argument together with Kinnunen, a colleague of mine, is that the rather rigid translation concept, both in the framework and probably also in the classrooms, creates hindrances in allowing the students of foreign languages to learn the kind of mediation skills that they need, not if they become professional translators and interpreters, but in the multilingual societies and workplaces that they will be moving in their life, and that the mediation skills, it's actually fascinating reading the mediation skills, they might benefit from understanding translatoriality in a broader sense, in particular in assessment, because if you have a very narrow mindset about what translation is and should be, and then you assess based on this equivalence-based sort of everything needs to be there, the mode needs to be same, you don't actually recognize when the students are very good at being flexible and innovative and finding embodied solutions and sort of doing teamwork in getting meanings across. So there's a clash, I see, of we think, in what is expected to be taught in the classrooms and how it might be sort of difficult to accomplish that if you have a very rigid notion of translation that you operate with. And finally, paraprofessional translation and interpreting. This is where I've been most active recently, actually. And there's a number of collaboration partners. First, the earlier one, Koskinen and Pilke. In 2017, we looked at bilingual meetings. So Finland, as a bilingual country, gives us a lot of possibilities of seeing how Finnish and Swedish operate together. So they had this data. I'll show you in a minute, and they asked me to join. And a similar thing happened actually with Rebecca Piekkari and Susanne Tietze. They had been working on understanding interlingual translation in organizations, and they invited me to join in to give a translation studies perspective. So this is also, I think, a wonderful new moment for translation studies. Has been going on maybe 10 years now. I get a lot of requests from scholars in many other fields to bring in the translation studies viewpoint and what we can offer so that they can understand better what they are trying to study. So there's a lot going on in that area. This is an example of the data that Nina Pilke and Merja Koskela had, and I don't expect you to be able to read this. It's first in Swedish and then in Finnish. What I want to draw your attention to is that this translation is maybe half of what the source text is. And it is actually, I tried, but I couldn't. I tried to match the different bits and pieces that are actually or can be considered translations of the source text, and it became so chaotic that I gave up. It is not in any way an equivalent or direct translation of what has been just said, but what it is a very clever and very agile way of moving forward the meeting agenda, making sure that everybody stays on board, because that the meeting participants, most of them have some Finnish and some Swedish. Many are fluent in both, and some really struggle with Swedish. So summarizing briefly what has been said, moving on allows them to not to extend their meeting time, although they function in two languages. And what happened is that Nina Koskela and Merja Koskela and Nina Pilke, they had collected this data. They had a lot of data from meetings. They were interested in meeting practices, and they came to a translation studies conference in Finland, showing their data, not this one, but similar, and asking the audience, is this translation? Can you help us? Is this was a translation studies conference. Can you help us? Is this actually translation or not? So that was the starting point of our collaboration and the paper. We started looking into what goes on and whether the three of us can agree. So our translation concepts, where are the elements where all three of us are in agreement that this is a translation of what happened before. And this is one of the examples where we discussed this a lot and then decided, all of us, that yes, this is actually a translation. So paraprofessional translators, like the chairperson that you saw in the previous example, it was the chair doing the translating as they often did. Paraprofessional translators is a term that I'm kind of perhaps pushing forward in translation studies, because it seems to me that it would be useful to more often than we currently do to differentiate between not only professional and non-professional translation, but also between non-professional translation that takes place in an entirely volunteer amateur context and the kind of translation where you are bound by your employment context and you have your professional norms from an other profession sort of playing into the same situation where you also might want to discuss the norms of translation. So it's kind of, I see these as different contexts for activities, and this is not my own sort of making, but borrowed from Anthony Pem's and Sergei Tylenev's publications. And I see the value of having this differentiation. Journalistic translation, I know there's several scholars in the audience who are looking into this, is by far, is so far the most research area in translation studies. It is also an area where I haven't had a chance to look into properly as to what you may have already found out about the specificities of paraprofessional translation in that particular context. I think there's plenty to be learned and then taken over to other kinds of paraprofessional contexts, like the organizations that I've been looking into, which is a different setting and different requirements, different needs, different purposes. But to me, this makes sense, and I can see that for many who recognize that they are actually operating with paraprofessional rather than non-professional translation, this sometimes is a helpful distinction to be made. So looking into professional translators versus paraprofessional translatoriality and why it is harder to call this paraprofessional translation is perhaps because it's so varied and so unbound by the constraints and norms that cover professional translation. So I'm now basing this on my own data on EU translators in particular, to look into multilingual organizations and how the world or life is different for professional translators there and paraprofessional translation. So EU translators as a special case of multilingual organization. I understand European Union institutions is not the whole story, but it is one of the well-known and widely studied. And on the other hand, I acknowledge that data from paraprofessional translatoriality in multilingual organizations is still fragmented. It's mainly coming actually not from translation studies, but from organization studies. So, and in international business. So scholars there are looking into these kinds of phenomena, not typically calling it paraprofessional translation, but looking into the languages and how they operate in these contexts. So there's a meta-analysis of these case studies by Piekkari and Tietze and myself, and an ongoing, a very interesting project now on interview data collected by Silvia Siuk and Martina Schlieva, and I've been invited again to join them in looking into this data. So this is, we haven't published yet, but this is the background. So what we can say about the message carrier in professional translation, it is another language version. This is EU language, obviously, with the same often legal effect and visual and material existence. So a lot of equivalence goes on in the institutional context of the European Union, also visual and material equivalence. What happens on the other side is a fit for purpose re-rendering of content, intermodal solutions, team effort, all kinds of flexible arrangements to carry meanings across. the role of the translator, you have professional translators are named, they are employed particularly for that purpose. There's a separate department that gives them an institutional setting and support. There's particular training and identity that comes along with the training and the professional status. And all of this creates a sort of a culture that I was studying in the Translating Institutions book. On the paraprofessional side, you have people operating alongside other tasks. They might be sometimes volunteering, sometimes they are forced to do this, they are asked to do it. They may recognize that they are actually also translating or not, and often not. And it is like sort of unexpected and largely unmanaged. This is one of the arguments with the organization studies people, that multilingual organizations are actually, they don't even know what goes on, and they are not managing this other kind of translating at all. Maybe they shouldn't even do that, but definitely they are not doing that. And the image of the translator in the professional side is of a trained professional communicator who has many competencies, at least a translation competence, but for example, via the EMT competence list, you know that it is growing and growing, and there's all these sub-competencies that are being mentioned. On the other side of the professional translatoriality, people don't really care about translation competence. What they want is somebody who speaks the particular language. So this is the, in the interview data, for example, this is the argument that the employee X has studied English, so obviously they are the best choice. You know this, so obviously this is sort of a the kind of understanding that has been going on in our parlance for quite some time, that people think that whoever knows the language can actually translate. In the paraprofessional side, this is true. It actually happens. They can translate in one way or another. And so what the scopus of the translation is for professional translators is very much equivalence-based legitimacy that is at stake. On the paraprofessional side, it is you are serving the needs of your clients, customers, or your colleagues. You want to help somebody out. You're pleasing your boss who asked you to turn the PowerPoints into another language. You participate in meaning making for processes like the metaphorical translation processes or practices, and you also execute power by being the one who can decide what things are being called and what messages are getting across. So all kinds of scopoi, not all of them necessarily well thought out or recognized, but very many different reasons also for being engaged in translatoriality. And I'm coming to an end of my talk, but there's a couple of slides still going that I need to talk about. One of them, this one is on methodology. So what we can say really is that language is at the heart of being human. And where we have multiple languages, also translatoriality, I'd argue, is at the heart of being human and communicating between humans. It's not exceptional, it's everywhere. And its absence really, this is actually sort of nodding back to Sherry Simon quotation. Its absence is worth careful analysis. If we, for some reason, we decide not to engage in translatoriality, it might be very interesting to ask why this happens. And the more translatorial the multilingual practices are, the less one needs to pay attention to them. And this is actually what happens in many multilingual organizations. They move around quite easily, and if the situation is good, if the practices are being implemented, if money is flowing in, there's no need to stop and think about it. It is more like it's like electricity maybe, as Patricia Glow was saying about effect. So translatoriality can also be kind of invisible like electricity, and we only notice it if it is cut out. And what is interesting is that in paraprofessional and obviously also non-professional practices, the translation concept, it's likely that it's going to be varied and not necessarily well thought out. So we can't really expect that people who engage in translatorial action in their other professional capacities are really giving it a lot of thought or consider it an important element of their work and necessary to think about. And this also goes for other fields, that as a translation scholar, you recognize that multilingualism studies or language revitalization studies, for example, what goes on in the field is there's a lot of translation and there's a lot of translatoriality, but not necessarily in their eyes. They name things differently and they have different viewpoints. So if one wants to study translatoriality, it's not that simple. And what I've come to recognize as a good way of approaching it is to look for any multilinguality and trust that there will be translatoriality. So kind of having translatoriality as a hypothesis of any multilingual situations, and then observing what is going on with the lens of a translation studies scholar and thinking about translatoriality and seeing when that happens, not necessarily, or where you can have an interview study, but if you ask about translation or translatoriality, even worse, your interviewees might not notice, particularly the more fragmented kinds of translatoriality. They escape their attention. So you need to find other ways of approaching your object of study. So finally, then, you may have recognized that my examples, they are all on interlingual translatoriality. And where I started with was that we actually have many modes of communication. And there's the intersemiotic and intralingual varieties also. So why focus on the interlingual when we have translatoriality everywhere in many modes? So I thought I'd address this issue and think through my own choices and why this has happened. And I'm seeing it from the viewpoint of a division of academic labor. This is the title of one of my talks next week, so we come back to this. But for now, let me just say that I have simply I didn't create a pathway. This is not like I consciously decided in 2009 that this is the next decade will be devoted on translatoriality, and I make the clever moves and come up with something that is really coherent and well thought out. So this is partially, well, not accidental, but I've been following my research interests and the opportunities that have been given to me and the invitations of other scholars. And it has so turned out that it's always or mainly in interlingual translatoriality that I have been operating on. And I am thinking of moving forward and I've taken some inroads into some of the other modes. But for now, I also feel that this makes sense for translation studies, that we don't abandon interlingual translatoriality or interlingual translation because there's so many other interesting areas of study also available for us. And I'm not saying that I would be against anyone looking into intersemiotic. I'm just saying that we also, and this is my response to maybe Kobus Marais and others who are willing to really expand, that where we are best and where we have most to contribute in these interdisciplinary encounters is for the time being interlingual translation and all the pre-existing research that we can draw on. It has come to me as a bit of a surprise that in these collaborations, what has been most useful is perhaps the traditional translation studies topics like equivalence, really understanding equivalence. And I had left equivalence behind me quite a while ago, and I recognized I need to rethink it. And I'm very grateful for all the earlier scholars who focused on this topic, and there's others. So I think for translation studies, this is something that we need to still keep on doing, although we might want to, and it's advisable even to go to all these new directions as well. So what I'm planning to do next, I'm hoping for some field work, because my feeling is that the observations and the actually the sort of being on the field and seeing what goes on is particularly important for the paraprofessional translation, because we know very little of it, and we can't generalize very much based on one particular context, because it is to be expected that the situation is going to be different in a different workplace. So we need to go there. Linguistic translatorial ethnography is something that I will be talking about next week a little bit, so just a mention here. We also need to continue theory building about paraprofessional translation, translatoriality, and if it even works, and whether better concepts might be coming along and how we can move forward. For me personally, the next steps that are currently ongoing are to link translatoriality with arts. I looked into a poetry session. This is published in the Translation and Affect book, and I've done some preliminary work on audio description, but it's not, none of it is publicly available yet. And then accessibility, that is coming on strong into translation studies and into the world. So translatoriality and how it links to accessibility is another area where I'm starting new thinking processes. Also, not for me, I think, because the different modes, it's not that easy to jump from one mode to another. That's another reason why I like to stick with interlingual, because that's the area that I'm familiar with. But for anyone, intermodal translatoriality in professional, paraprofessional, and non-professional practice obviously is a strong new direction to be looked into. And why would we do this? As I've been discussing, we have a discipline that is currently in transit, I feel, and we need to rethink what matters to translation studies and how will translation studies matter to the world, and how we define the object of study, and do we need to agree on the object of study, and also how we can be relevant in contemporary world, and I think we definitely can. I feel very strongly that translation studies is needed in this world of mediation, understanding, and meaning making across communication modes, often being difficult and challenging. We are not living in a harmonious world, so definitely understanding better how we can successfully communicate across languages, across different communication situations and for different audiences and so on and so forth, hasn't lost any of its value. And finally, this is like I keep repeating myself from yesterday, training professionals into tomorrow's translation scene. I think it will be beneficial to open their eyes to the many scenarios where translation competencies will be needed, although people are not talking about translating. They are not using the translation concept, but they are operating in a translatorial manner. That's all for today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kaisa, for a very rich talk on a very important issue. I think it's almost existential. A lot of food for thought and also for discussion. We still have some time. We're running out of time actually, but we'll just extend the time slot a bit. And I would like to open the floor and to invite you to raise your virtual hand, look, and to take the floor.
Yeah, good morning, Kaisa, and good morning to all the others. Sorry, I wasn't there yesterday. It's the first talk of yours that I'm able to attend. It's interesting, Peter, that the word I wrote down was existential as well. It's a very existential topic for our discipline, indeed. And of course, what I also like, and I can imagine that also the students or the PhD researchers like that, is that you are very honest in spreading hesitation. We very often we are not sure at all about our concepts, and what we thought 10 years ago is not at all what we think nowadays. In general, and that was an interesting turn in your talk, you said I opened up 10, 15 years ago to this broadening, to this extension of translation. But in the end, you then very much return to the interlingual specificity, if you want. You know, I don't think we can do without these broadenings. You know that I worked on journalistic translation, on museum translation recently, and there is a PhD student working on intralingual translation as well. And you refer to, well, maybe the two most extreme examples nowadays. You refer to Michael Cronin, to Corpus Mare, where it's not even anymore about intersemiotic and about semiotics, but about semiosis, which is everything more or less, which is highly interesting from a knowledge point of view, from an epistemological point of view for us as researchers as well, I think. But there, it very much, and that was also a concept that you used a lot, it's very much about communication. It's very much about representation. And that is where I hesitate sometimes as well. I mean, on the one hand, when it's about communication, about representation, that opens up a lot of doors for interdisciplinary research, of course, and for interdisciplinary collaboration. But we know very often that interdisciplinary collaboration in translation studies often means a one-way direction. That's, well, we are looking for collaboration, but not always in communication studies and other disciplines. And on the other hand, and that's what you mentioned as well, there is that, well, need or necessity of specificity of a discipline. And to what extent do we need that? That tension between interdisciplinarity on the one hand and need for interdisciplinarity, and on the other hand, specificity of a discipline or specificity of knowledge. I would like you to comment a bit more on that. By the way, I very much agree with your idea that the use of T&I studies is counterproductive nowadays. I've always been against it because I think it's not a good idea for a discipline to stress to practices only, whereas we have many more practices that we cover nowadays, like adaptation, like localization, etc.
Thank you. I'm a little bit sort of the word existential is not really what I had in mind, so I'm a little bit like, whoa, okay, yeah, I can see what you mean. Difficult questions, and where do I start? I start by saying that yesterday I actually sort of told the audience that it's my understanding of the summer schools that you want to give the backstage view of what you do. That's why I'm sort of continuing the same line today, because I think it is something that, at least for me, when I was a young scholar, I kind of, to me, and you need to remember this was back in the 1990s, when there were not that many conferences and we did not see each other and there were no YouTube videos and stuff. So I hardly imagined that the theoreticians that I was quoting to be humans. They were kind of figures and very sort of, I don't know, scary a little bit. So I feel that it is, the summer school is an opportunity to show that we all learn and we grow and we have our hesitations and doubts and we try to deal with it. And I have my doubts about how to approach the current status and stage of translation studies, because I don't know if this is also an age issue, because I used to be a young rebel, I suppose, and now I'm among those who say that no, let's not go too far. So it could be perhaps also that, but I am kind of I feel that while we need to take stock of what is going on and jump into new possibilities and developments, we at the same time we need to have some bearing. And for me, translation studies and the core of the concept of translation still is very much interlingual. And then we can expand from there. It makes sense to me to somehow acknowledge that many of the processes and phenomena related to translating we have first uncovered in the context of interlingual translation, and then we can see if we can move these to intralingual situations. Like myself, I'm looking into easy language now and in calling it, understanding it as intralingual translation. Not everybody agrees, but I see it that way. And so it makes sense to me to try and sort of see what we have already learned sort of collectively about interlingual translation and compare and contrast it to these new situations and different modes. And if we stop working on interlingual translation, if we freeze the, I don't know, the bearing, maybe it starts to become hollow. I don't know if I'm making sense at all, but it's kind of, I'm not ready to let go of interlinguality as one of the core elements of translation studies, while I'm still very much okay and also myself willing to move into other directions. But for now, for the current sort of my own current research, I feel that moving away from professional translation and a narrow translation concept and still looking into interlingual translation in these other new contexts that come to light allows me to see new things and develop new understandings. And it just simply seems pertinent to myself to not venture too far away from that area yet, because there's still a wealth of new findings to be found, for example, in the paraprofessional side of interlingual translation. So people can make their own choices. This has been mine, and we'll see where the translation studies discipline will move forward to, and whether we stay a discipline, because disciplinary borders and boundaries, they can be built, but they can also be dismantled. So we'll see. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Luke.
To be continued.
The second question is written in the chat box. It's by Vladimir Balakhonov. I will read it aloud. How exactly does the concept of translatoriality avoid the dichotomy translation versus interpreting? Could you elaborate a bit?
Yeah, I didn't say too much about this. I recognize now. To me, this goes back to a very sort of old debate back at my home university, when translation studies became the name of the new discipline. There was a lot of discussion in Finland what to call it in Finnish, and it became käännöstiede, which is the science of translating, maybe. So very different from translation studies. And people who were sort of close allies of Holz-Mänttäri and sort of taking the theory forward, they were adamantly against it. And they wanted to call it translatologia, which is, to my ear then, was too complex, unnecessarily sort of foreign and not so good. And their argument was actually coming from the German language, that in translatology, it makes no difference between oral and written, but käännöstiede in Finnish, because we have kääntäminen and tulkkaus. I'm sorry about just using Finnish examples all the time, but they are two separate terms. So we fixated on the written, similar to translation studies. It kind of foregrounds the written, and hence we had the debates about where does interpreting belong. And translatology, and in my parlance now, translatoriality, is indifferent to whether something is written or oral, or whether it moves from written to oral, from oral to written, and sort of the modes, they are not in a hierarchical position. This is obviously, you can't see it from the term. So if you look at translatoriality and you have a written translation in mind, it seems like it is a continuation. It's just the Holz-Mänttärian background kind of from in my head allows me to free myself from the dichotomy, but it's not in the term. You are quite right in that.
Okay, thank you, Vladimir and Kaisa. Sarah?
Hi, Kaisa. Hi, everyone. So my question has a lot to do with what we were discussing with Luke, and it's very simple, is why is it so important for translation studies to define translation very strictly, and why do we see this as such an existential issue? In literary studies, for example, the discussion of what is literature or not has been abandoned. So isn't this effort to define translation in fact what is limiting us to only study particular types of translation, or to see it as a problem when translation is seen as something more broader? And then connected to this, when you mention that there is a Klein, I would just like if you could explore that a bit further. Do you see those circles as so is there a degree of translationness or translatoriality?
Oh, wow. Yes, first defining translation. Yeah, actually, I always thought that it is not necessary that everybody has the same idea of translation in translation studies, and that we need to agree on it. And I've sort of, I haven't perhaps seen that earlier in my career. I haven't seen that an interesting debate. I think that was perhaps why I didn't pay too much attention to Halversson's papers when they were first published, because I was like, who cares? But now I think I'm kind of perhaps introducing the term of translatoriality is my way of saying let's move forward with a different, let's take a different angle, because we will never, I feel, we will never come up with a definition that everybody can agree on and is somehow still relevant for us. So for me, translatoriality is a way of sort of bypassing the question of translation. I don't know if it works, but I definitely see what you mean, and I also understand that this is definitely not a question that would be unique to translation studies. I think this is a question for most disciplines, that they have, well, at least in the humanities and social sciences, that there's no fixed object that somehow could be, that we could circle it and we could sort of look at it from all angles and say that we've covered this now, because the activities are moving and changing and the societies are moving and changing. So definitely, yeah, we are responding to current situations, and I feel that my way of responding to my own research pathway and the new encounters and the new object of study has been to kind of think about translatoriality. It's not the other way around, that I wanted to overcome or somehow contribute to the discussion of what translation is, and hence I developed translatoriality and started looking for it in every direction. It went the other way around, that I had these new interests that forced me to rethink what I'm actually even looking at. And the second question about the scale, I must say I'm not that far yet. I don't know. It could be that there's a scale of initially I'd say probably, or it seems logical that that might be the case, but I lack a lot of empirical data about, for example, concepts of translation in people's heads that I don't dare say. I'm not sure, but it's an interesting proposition. I'll think about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I see there are a lot more questions. Let's take two more and then we will end this morning lecture, morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone, or evening or even night. So the next question is a question clearly from the University of Tartu by Irina Siseikina in the chat box. According to the concepts of Yuri Lotman and Peter Torup, everything is translation. There is no stop, no line, even the ideas we have adopted long ago and consider as something of our very own. Can it mean that elements of translatoriality can be seen everywhere?
Yes, indeed. This is when you take this to the extreme, as some translation studies scholars are also sort of seem to be willing to take it, this is the outcome really, that we can start seeing, because everything is in flux, everything is changing, and we are also always reinterpreting. So I suppose, yes, if you want to, you can go that far. It's just that personally, I don't. I kind of see still that it's more meaningful to somehow narrow the phenomena that you are trying to understand, so that it does not, if you're trying to study, if you're trying to theorize something that is everywhere and everything, it is a really, really difficult task. So I'm not ready to go in that direction. I can see that this is philosophically we can come up with this kind of an understanding of translation or translatoriality, but it's perhaps not sort of methodologically, this is not where I want to go. I don't, yeah, maybe that is my, at least my current answer.
Okay, thank you. So I think existentially speaking, we are also translations, DNA translations. So the last question is for the founding father of the CETRA Summer School, and CETRA as a whole, José.
Thank you very much. I simply want to say hello, but that's not why I take the floor. I apologize. I'm going to greet you in a more explicit way. But I congratulate everyone, and certainly, first of all, our speaker. I have a particular question, and you might say it's an old story. I'm sure it's not an old story at all. I was very happy to see how much you insisted on organization theory. A few years ago, we invited here Rebecca Piekkari, and it's about one of her statements that I'm going to ask a question. Before doing that, I refer to an article of hers that I have never seen quoted by translation scholars. It's an article by Piekkari and her colleagues about a company, probably, maybe not in Finland, a company where they have a translation service, but translation is so much part of everyday life that the staff members of the company phone to their family and in order to ask, how do you translate this or that? Everyone in that full company is behaving like a translation body. And the professional translation illustrates one of the distinctions you make. But my point, and it's short now, my point is about this. We asked Rebecca Piekkari, why didn't you speak about indirect translation? Now she said, she quoted you, she referred to you, and she said the reason why it's difficult to integrate indirect translation into the field of translation or translation studies is that we, in indirect translation, we have no original. Well, whatever the criterion means, but if indirect translation is not part of our field and of our occupations, it means that we exclude an enormous percentage of contemporary international discourse, first of all, business life, and the entire question of lingua franca. I think it was Rene Meilaerts who wrote, maybe not for the first time, that there is no lingua franca without translation. And the European Union is producing quite a lot as translation or translated discourse via indirect translation. So what should we do with indirect translation? Sorry, I'll stop here.
Thank you, José.
Okay, thank you. Shall I answer? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Lovely to meet you again, José, virtually at least. Yeah, I'm familiar with Rebecca's paper that you mentioned, and I also have found out that this is sort of from the interview data, it comes out very clearly that this is not uncommon, that employees actually seek the help of their family members in difficult translation situations. So it is one interesting element of paraprofessional translation is the collaboration aspect and the extended cognition, if you like, how in how it operates. As to indirect translation, I think I need to be I'm sort of guessing here a little bit, but I think it will be difficult to take that into account because it is even more invisible. So invisibility coefficient is kind of doubled or tripled if there's several movements between different languages and you can't necessarily trace the first original. So I definitely agree that indirect translation is an interesting translational phenomenon, and we need to keep on looking into it, definitely. And I'm sure there's a lot to learn. The other colleague who's been working with me, Susanne Tietze, has published a lot on lingua franca, particularly English in the modern companies, and would definitely agree on Reine's argument that it's that lingua franca usage is it's a lot about translating. But as to there being no original, brought to my mind something that I was thinking I'd mention and I didn't mention in the lecture, that if we want to somehow delimit what translating is, and not take on board everything and all, then one criterion in my head is that there needs to be some sort of a source for there to be translation. And if you can't, it can be fragmentary, it can be multiple, it can be all kinds of things like in journalistic translation. Well, many people here know that it's not a simple question finding the source, and there can be many. But if there's none that can be identified by the researcher or the assumed translator, then probably the process is something else. Then we are probably not talking about translating. So the idea of there not being an original, but there still being some translation is for me, at least for now, a little bit alien. So maybe, I don't know, I can't speak for Rebecca's sake, but on her behalf, but maybe she was somehow thinking differently, or had an other translation concept in mind, which sort of I keep repeating, but we never know. At least for me, I barely know my own, let alone somebody else's translation concept, so that when in communication we could easily speak sort of not understanding one another, but thinking that we are in agreement. So I don't know, but definitely indirect translation is an interesting phenomenon. I don't know anyone having looked at it in paraprofessional side, probably in journalistic translation, because I think there's chains there a lot. So that would be an element that you guys have already seen. But from the organization side, I don't know of anyone looking into it yet. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, or we couldn't, or we could leave it out. That would be a mistake, I'm sure.
Okay, Kaisa, thank you so much for your lecture, for answering our questions. You haven't answered all the questions because we have some more in the chat box. Maybe you can read them, and in a later stage during the summer school, we will have the opportunity of answering them. Maybe I would also like to thank all the participants for having attended this second lecture. The day after tomorrow at 9 a.m. There will be another lecture by Kaisa Koskinen about using and reusing concepts. So we will then continue our discussion. But thank you so much, and take good care of you.
Thank you, Peter. Before we go, can I say a few words for those who are coming to my tutorials today and later? Just briefly.
Absolutely.